Our next event is our keynote speaker, and I'd like to introduce Kevin Gray to the stage. Kevin is a professor at Yale SOM, at Yale School of Architecture. He's a tremendous asset and member to our Yale area conference committee. Kevin has secured countless speakers here, and I just think always, most notably, annually, I try to point out, if you see Kevin outside having coffee, he's always talking to students. Without a doubt, he's secured the most jobs for students in Yale's history, just in the real estate field. So please welcome Kevin Gray.
Thank you, François. Thank you very much. So, have you noticed that on television and movies, real estate people are always the bad guy? Really, it's just really beginning to annoy me but I think it's because real estate is so important in our lives, where we live, work, and play, that the general public and the TV watching audience cares about real estate and it resonates with them. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce one of the good guys, François Trausch. He is someone who really is a thought leader in the business, and as one of the largest equity owners of real estate globally, he runs PIMCO Allianz's gigantic portfolio with the understanding that what he does really matters. It matters in people's lives. And he's also been a great friend of Yale. He's been a frequent guest in my class. Every year when my students go with me to MIPIM, he hosts us in his beautiful apartment. And I claim you for Yale, François. So thank you for coming.
Maybe you could put the other slide back, if you don't mind, on over there, the previous one, if you don't mind. So, Kevin, many thanks for your kind introduction. It's actually quite an honor to come and speak at the Yale alumni class, especially I'm not a Yale alumni. But I really have appreciated the body of students here, very diverse, with people coming from architecture, some from different departments, and of course of the SOM school as well. So, listen, when Kevin is very persistent, so he called me a year ago saying, I would like you to come at the alumni conference. So I had to commit a year ago to this conference. And then 6 months ago, I get another call from Kevin and said, what's the title of your presentation? You know what, I'm not a professional conference speaker, so I didn't really have a title in mind. So the title in the program, which says, and you saw it in the previous slide, which is now gone, the shifting landscape of real estate, navigating opportunities is an evolving world, is of course produced by ChatGPT, because it's fairly bland, okay? And I'm not going to bore you with, of course, that title. I actually would like to take you on a journey which is slightly different than maybe what you expect. So that journey is as follows. As we think about the real estate going forward and looking back maybe at the last 25 years, because I think we are at the end of some sort of super cycle entering in something different. Yes, the financier, to call it that way, was probably the number one skill set required, to take advantage of the brick and mortar asset class and transform it into basically a true investment asset class. And I think the growth of that asset class is a testament that, it became a fully fledged investment class. Going forward, so I'm basically questioning whether, engineering mindset and skills is not what you would require. Think about all these offices you would have to retool, and then of course the decarbonization challenge we all have. And maybe we have forgotten as well that it's important to be an urbanist. We love New York, but where is the New York of tomorrow in terms of grit? And then in a fractured world, having some skill set of being an anthropologist, might help, to bring the different people together and different communities in our real estate. So that's sort of the little journey I would like to go through. I will go fairly fast so that we have also maybe some time for some Q&A. Just my background so that I started my career, I live in Paris, but I started my career at Goldman Sachs in 1988. 1988 is a big bang in London, you know, the deregulation of financial market, and a whole bunch of new graduates entered the world of finance, of equity sales and trading, fixed income sales and trading, and I was no exception, and I had fun doing it. And then I used the 2 years at Harvard Business School, though, to basically pivot and go into real estate. I liked cash flows, but I also liked architecture, so I figured out real estate seems to be what you need to do. Except that, of course, in 93, when I graduated from HBS, you know, the thing about real estate, if you are coming out at the wrong time, there's just no jobs, you know, and 93 was terrible. Huh? There was the S&L crisis in the US. And luckily, Jerry Speyer came on campus and he said, you know what, I will hire you in New York as long as you don't do any development, any fancy acquisition. I'm going to do office leasing in New York. And in a way, that was a very good service he gave me, because learning leasing in New York is, when you know that, you can do lots of things, you know, because everything is included in this, you know, negotiations, you know, financial personalities and everything which goes with it, you know. I did end up doing 1 year in Berlin working on a big development. Tishman Speyer was doing that. And then, you know, thinking about the financier, I basically started a long career, didn't expect it to be so long, at GE Capital. And I think of all the companies, you know, who took advantage of how to apply finance into different real assets, I think GE Capital at the time had really mastered that, you know, with real estate, with basically airlines, with receivables, with credit cards, you know. And I think in the real estate field, it meant bringing Excel into basically bricks and mortar, you know, and that enables, you know, to do NPLs on a big scale. It enabled to do large portfolios on a big scale. It enabled to do more leverage, manage the cash flows, and everything which we now know, which has been so successful for us. And that career, of course, ended rather abruptly in 2015 when GE Capital exited its financial services. But the last 5 years had been in Asia, and accumulated a fair amount of knowledge about that part of the world, which gave me the opportunity then to basically be able to move over to Allianz and be their global head for their real estate business. At that time, they had no exposure to Asia. It was all in Europe and some in the US. The period between 97 and 2015 was not a quiet period, by the way. You know, we had the dot-com bubble, we had the S&L crisis before, we had, of course, 2008. So that was not necessarily an easy period. We tend to forget that, you know, rates go up and down, and that happened during that period. But we got used from 2010 or 12 onwards to that basically amazing run with low rates, which basically fueled an entire industry and gave opportunities for investors which were underexposed to real estate, basically to get what they needed in real estate. A few words on the portfolio. As Kevin mentioned, PIMCO Prime Real Estate is the investment manager whose main job is, to be quite frank, to manage the investment, real estate investment book of Allianz, the German insurance company. That portfolio today represents 92 billion euros, so close, I think we're close to parity these days with the USD. It's one of the largest real estate mandates in the world. I think the other two are ADIA, the sovereign wealth fund in Abu Dhabi, and APG, the Dutch pension fund. So you can see who are the active investors in real estate over the last decade. Insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, a lot of the global pension fund. I think the particularity of the mandate is that it's made out of three buckets, which complement each other. One is a direct equity bucket. We buy and manage assets and manage them directly. An indirect bucket, which ended up being a very good way to basically increase your reach. You know what? You invest with competitors, then you know what they are doing. You make money because if you pick the right manager, you know they should give you your money back and more. And you can develop, you know, relationships across the world. I very often use the example of Blackstone. I think we have close to $1 billion investment in the different Blackstone fund on behalf of Allianz, but we probably have another $1 billion of business with Blackstone, financing them, buying assets, and so on and so on. And then, of course, we have that business in-house as well. So that's very convenient, of course, because unlike a bank, you know, if you do lending and if you can take the asset back, you know how to manage it. And we tend to lend on assets which we would otherwise also own in our equity portfolio. So unlike US insurance companies, European insurance companies, from a regulatory point of view, can hold real estate assets and it's not too onerous. So if I look back at basically the history of the portfolio, Allianz real estate business sort of started in basically 2010. Achleitner, a Goldman Sachs partner who moved over to Allianz, had come up with a very good approach to say, you know what, insurance companies if they do insurance and investment, they don't, one of the two they're not going to do well, and usually the head of an insurance in France, if he has to buy an asset, or he or she has to buy an asset, they look out of the window and buy the assets they see, and you don't end up with a diversified portfolio. So Allianz made the decision to split the insurance business during insurance contract from the investment business and leave it to real estate professionals in the case of real estate, and taking all this real estate and real estate departments away from the insurance company and creating basically a separate company came to the 22 billion. That portfolio grew to 43 billion when basically I arrived. And then that portfolio, we doubled again from 43 to 95 billion over the last 7 years. As I was preparing for this presentation, I asked my team, okay, why don't you run me what has been interest rates during that period of time, okay? And we took the German interest rates. And you can see that the correlation is not bad, meaning as rates was coming down, we were buying more, okay? So I'm not saying anybody could have taken my job, just follow the rates and you grow your portfolio. I hope not. And I'll tell you maybe why I think it's not the case. But you can see what happened in the market. And at that time, if somebody had 4% allocation to real estate, that person wanted to go to 10 and bought a lot of real estate. Allianz, which was already at 10, wanted to stay at 10 in a market where bonds, where all of a sudden was not 100, but 300. So you had to, just to keep at 10, you had to buy a lot. So everything was going in one direction. Now that equities or bonds are back from 300 to 100, schematically, the denominator effect is going to be extremely sticky on the way down, and it's not going to magically go away, because there are not many sales happening as well. So you can see that I think the investment in real estate will be plateauing for basically quite a while. When I joined in 2015, I recall a conversation with the CEO of Allianz who said, listen, we want you to keep to 10%. That means we will need to double our annual investments. And having come from Asia, I said, fine, I think that's a good idea. And real estate provides an additional yield which you don't have in bonds. And by the way, for your long-term liabilities, real estate is a very good match. But don't ask me to buy yet a German office building. So if you are willing to add new strategies every year, and schematically, if I maybe simplify it here, but traditionally an insurance company was buying core office. That's what they were doing, okay? If you added, other asset classes like retail, residential, or others, you're adding, 4 ways to invest from one. If you then says, what, I'm willing to do it in core, that's my market, but maybe 20% of my portfolio, I do it in value add and opportunistic, I'm adding 3 more strategies. If I'm willing to do it in different kinds of way, not just direct by joint ventures and funds, 3 more ways. And then if I'm having a global book, not just Europe, all of a sudden you go from 1 times 4 times 3 times 3 times 3, you go to 108 ways to invest, okay? It's a bit schematical. We probably cover half of these investment strategies, but it was a mind change set for them to broaden, their basically the way to invest and onboard basically new asset class. Fast forward to what the portfolio looks today. It's still heavy on Europe. You see it on the first quadrant, 70 to 75%. But, for example, Asia Pacific, which was non-existent or very small, now represents a significant part. Office, 20 years back, office or even more was probably 90%. Okay, it's still 50%. You could argue it's a lot. Probably a bit too much versus market. But at least the other half has been quite diversified. Core is 80%. That's normal that you expect that from an insurance company. And then, as I mentioned before, important for an insurance company to be aware that there are certain things they do well and others they don't do well. I think insurance companies are good buyers. They are not always the best sellers because they tend to miss a market by the time you get them to a decision. So I think if your strategy is to buy, fix, sell, we would rather give it to a manager and they call the market. If it's buy and fix and keep, of course, we would do that ourselves. So where does this leave us, going forward and on the financial side of the business? First of all, I think what the current period is telling us is that real estate is inflation linked. The dark line is basically over a long period of time office rent. The blue line is inflation. Below is a deflated, so the net rate. And you can see that there you still have a growth from 100 to 150 on rents on a long period of time. The same on valuation. So we should never forget that cap rates are real rates and not nominal rates. And in a way, the spread there has not changed that much. So I think what the current period is telling us is that yes, real estate has an inflation component, which I think long-term duration investors tend to appreciate. But of course, a big question, and I think there was in the previous panel, what's going to happen to rates? I will keep it very simple on the rates, because otherwise, if I go into a detailed PIMCO talk on rates, we could have a long discussion. So I'm going to keep it very simple. I think there's two ways to think about rates, okay? Maybe it's too simplistic for this audience, sorry, okay? You either think it's Matterhorn, the mountain in Zermatt, which a spike in rates and then a sharp drop, that has happened sometimes in the history. Or you think it's closer to Table Mountain, the mountain in South Africa, and there, you are at a plateau and you will be there for quite a while. And I think that's probably the scenario most people think, and I think it was echoed in the previous panel, that we are more in Table Mountain territories than Matterhorn. For good or for bad, that also means that rates will remain much longer. So that's sort of the financial picture. So let's go back to our four characters here, the financiers, the engineers, the urbanists, and the anthropologist. I think you're going to see a lot of investors now focusing, I think, back on the brick and mortar to go forward. I know the financier looks more fun, maybe he's French, engineer is more German, looks like maybe less fun, okay? That's the world we're entering, okay? But, and I think what's going to happen is that investors and maybe that's more of a European lens, will use basically the drive to decarbonize their portfolio, to get to net zero, to basically do the triage they have to do on their portfolio between the good asset and the bad asset, specifically on office. This will serve as an accelerator, in my view, of the triage which is required going forward, to basically in the portfolio weed out those assets which don't have a chance to survive. And the way we are thinking about it is, first of all, it's not an endeavor which we are alone into it. Allianz federated a large number of institutional investors, many are of course based in Europe, who basically committed to reduce the carbon footprint of their portfolio by 25% measured in 2024. That's a big endeavor because it's an absolute reduction of portfolio. Baseline is 2019. In the meantime, portfolios can grow. And they do it using the Science-Based Target Initiative, meaning no offsetting, so you cannot buy credits or you cannot plant a forest to offset it. And you have to use a methodology which is called CRREM, Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor, which is now the prevalent methodology used by most institutional investors in Europe and more globally to get to a net zero path line. And the way it works, and you will see that on the slide on the top part, what CRREM is doing, CRREM is an institution. It was initiated out of the European Union. And what they do, they say, okay, France, you committed to reduce your carbon footprint by 100 with the Paris Accord. The apportionment to commercial real estate is 50, to commercial real estate is 30. So they apportion this up to the asset level and say that asset has a carbon footprint of 20. And that 20 will go to zero by 2050. So it's creating a pathway to zero. They do it on the carbon footprint, and they do it as well on the energy consumption. And the interesting thing about that methodology, it takes into account the grid. So if a country has nuclear, like France, the path is less steep than a country which would have coal, okay? So the effort doesn't have to be as strong. And so here's an example. You see the pathway of an office in Paris in gray, and below is the energy reduction pathway. And below, how we measure the asset at acquisition, and then at all times, the asset has to remain below the path line. And if it does not, you have to come up with a measure, a capex measure, to basically, reduce your energy consumption or reduce your carbon footprint, okay? Carbon footprint reduction, by the way, is not necessarily that difficult. The first thing you have to do is get off gas and electrify your building, okay? And then the second thing is you need to convince your tenants to move to green energy. You do that, you win 3 or 4 years in your pathway, just by getting the tenants to agree to switch to green energy. We make it a condition when a new tenant comes in to say they have to basically sign up for green energy. And then, of course, at some point of time, you have to do the heavy lifting and change the windows, change the systems, and so on. The second thing I wanted to also say, if you go down clockwise, is that we should not underestimate the importance, not just to reduce your carbon footprint, but also to work on the resilience of your real estate. Because we know, regardless of what we do, climate change is already there. And therefore, assessing, your exposure to natural disaster, I think, is essential as you look at an asset For the insurance company, it's obvious because real estate is there to match a long-term liability. It's not there to double down on the liability, okay, which you are supposed to face. So, of course, the filter is very, very strong for us to ensure that all assets we on board, are very are resilient as we can. And then, of course, technology will play in a very important role. Coming back to the engineer, collecting data on the energy performance, ensuring that when you put you change the heating in your system on the wall, it does actually in the boiler room something happens as well. It's not always the case, by the way. And I think that's a new thing is for the first time institutional investors have to understand what's happening in the building. What is the true occupancy in your building? You say, well, the occupancy is 100%. Yes, on the lease, but the reality of who is in your building is very different. And so what we have started to do is to basically put sensors in our building and measure at all times the true occupancy by desk. Because this is an example in our own office, because for privacy reasons, we cannot just go in tenant space and put all these sensors. We need to work with them. But in the case here of our office in Paris, you can see them. This example, we had a 51% capacity, 76 desks occupied out of 150. I can assure that was not on a Friday, okay? Probably not on a Monday, but I think that's a very new approach to say, if I know what's happening in the space of our tenant, then I can proactively engage with the tenant and basically anticipate, when they're going to get out of the lease if nobody is in the office, or even tell them, listen, on certain days of the week, why don't we reduce your AC consumption so that collectively, we can reduce the energy consumption of the building. And so you will see a lot of investors now tracking the actual occupancy of the building. There is a benchmark done by CBRE. That benchmark is at 36%. It's not very high as true occupancy. I suspect, I hope it's on a 7-day week, not 5-day. Otherwise, I know it's fairly low. And we measure now for the buildings which we own, what is the occupancy. If we cannot put sensors, we put them at the entrance of the tenant space and measure people coming in and out, and of course engage with the tenant for them to give us the number of desks they have so that we get a sense of occupancy. So you will see that, all that work will require management of data, creating sometimes a digital twin of your asset, getting engaged in things which, as a financier, you might not have been as used to do. So let's continue on our journey. I think one skill set we might have forgotten in our journey is the skill set of being an urbanist. Okay, because of course it doesn't, as we learned from I think some of the U.S. cities, if you could have the perfect building, if you are in a non-perfect city, given a point of time, it's not going to help your occupancy. So. April 2020, I get another call from the Allianz CIO, a different CIO. He had changed in the meantime. And he tells me, well, listen, everybody's working from home. What does it mean for our office portfolio? And of course, in April 2020, we didn't really know. So we huddled together and came up with an assumption, which was as follows. It was to say, listen, if I'm a tenant and I have 5 buildings, and if I had to only keep one, I probably would keep the most central one where everybody can easily get to, okay? And if I am a landlord and I have one building, I'm better off having it central as well, because if my tenant shrinks, I probably have more substitution tenants willing to take the space versus, if I in a more specific submarket. So we did a 3-kilometer radius around all our cities in which we have the holdings to see how much of our office assets were within the 3-kilometer radius. And 90% of the office book was in that range, maybe not surprisingly for a fairly core asset. And by and large, I would say that the performance of our assets within that radius has been actually very good, okay? When I say that, it has been very good in Europe, it has been very good in Asia, it has been much less very good, I wouldn't say terrible, in the US, because in some of the cities, the entire circle, San Francisco has gone bad, so it didn't really matter if you were in the circle or not, okay? And so you can see that, the US really is different than the rest. So I always tell my American friends, you have a lens from where you sit, but the situation is maybe different elsewhere. And I think it's due to the fact that in the US, strangely enough, and maybe counterintuitively, the buildings are older. An average building in New York is 60 years old. The commute is longer. Where you live, you have room to stay and work from home. And maybe work is more tailorized, I mean, Americans invented Model T, they applied it also to the service industry, and therefore you are fairly efficient working from home. You don't need to huddle with your colleagues to understand who is supposed to do what, which in Europe we do a lot, maybe we are less organized. So here's an interesting statistic about the change in office re-entry compared to pre-pandemic baseline, just to set the stage, how the world shapes out, and you can see three really different trifurcation between Asia in green, Europe in crimson, and US in Yale blue, maybe. Okay, so you can see that Paris at -15 versus London at -35. Houston -39 versus San Francisco at -58. It's a very small print. This was looked in May and January 23. I think some of the numbers in the US are improving, actually, probably. I just came back from New York and I thought it was actually quite busy, the streets and so on. So I would assume that, this will improve over time. But basically, that's sort of the lay of the land. So the reason I wanted to mention that is that I think I still believe that density matters, and being in a more dense urban environment is conducive to better occupancy of your buildings. And you don't have to look at the future to see what can be done on that. I live in Paris, and for those of you who have been to Paris, probably a lot of you, you have the famous Haussmann building. The Haussmann building, Haussmann was a developer, under Napoleon III in 1850, and he got the mandate to reorganize Paris, the leader, Napoleon III, was a bit of an autocrat, a bit like in China. He could just bulldoze, neighborhoods and do his avenues, okay, which we enjoy today. But beyond that, I think he basically came up with a concept which is as follows. The Haussmannian quarters, to date, is the most dense built environment ever built. Higher than skyscrapers. Why is that? Because the Haussmannian quarters are very attached to each other. You see a front building, but very often you have a back building as well, okay? So it creates a lot of density. So that's number one. And number two, these buildings by design were mixed use because retail was on the ground floor and above you had residential. It was mixed socially because the more wealthy people were in the front and the very wealthy people were on the second floor because that's where the ceiling height was highest. The maybe less wealthy people were in the back building. And then these buildings have gone through many usages. They started as residential building. Many got converted into office. This is a conversion which we have done for Givenchy, Avenue Georges V, which is now their global headquarters. So it's a building which has gone through many different usages without necessarily having to be demolished. A little bit like some of your older buildings in New York. The only thing you could argue about maybe Haussmann, it's fairly mineral. In a world where, it's getting warmer and warmer, it can be quite warm in Paris. So we can just switch to another city, which I know well, Munich. That's basically the Allianz headquarters at the English Garden. English Garden is a fabulous park in the middle of Munich. And when Allianz moved their headquarters from Berlin to Munich after the war, they commissioned a new building, which you see in front. But more interesting, in the back, you see sort of this building. So what Allianz has done, they have 4,000 people working there. They basically accumulated a certain number of office buildings in that neighborhood, all connected with basically tunnels and very close to nature. So it's a way to basically connect your headquarters to nature, still be in the city center, and the architect was specialized in church construction. So, I mean, maybe that's why it doesn't look like a traditional office building, but that's what makes it interesting. I think for those who know Hazarwick, the UK architect, he called it the blandemic. Blandemic meaning real estate became quite bland in terms of how it look and feel, and maybe over time you can see that if you can keep the buildings interesting, I think that's good. The issue, I think, from an urban point of view is what to do with our large business district, okay? This is an example of Paris La Défense. For those who know Paris, it's just outside of Paris. That's where the city has allowed high-rises to be built. And yeah, it's very mineral. It's 100% office. Nobody wants to live there, by the way, okay? And so this business district will need to go through basically a reinvention. La Défense will be fine because there's always, at some point of time, a clearing level of the rent where somebody who is in some other suburbs will come to La Défense because it's well connected. It's a bit like 6th Avenue in New York. At some point of time, these big buildings will find tenants if the rent is probably low enough. I think an example which I think is more interesting is Canary Wharf. You know, Canary Wharf, of course, doesn't have the luxury of La Défense to be the only game in town if you want to a high rise. Now HSBC moved from Canary Wharf to St. Paul. But what Brookfield has done quite well is they basically said, you know what, why don't we put residential there? Now with the Elizabeth line in 15 minutes, you know, I'm in the center of London. You come from China, you are used to a building with amenities. You want a working shower, which in London is not always possible because of the Victorian pipes, okay? And you go to Canary Wharf and you have a beautiful building, you know, and I think they have been quite clever to try to reinvent that way. Another interesting example, I think, to think through is universities. Of course, nobody can replicate the beautiful campus of Yale, okay? So that's, you know, 200 years of history or more. But here are two examples of vertical campuses where basically towers were converted or built. On the left-hand side is an example in Japan, which is basically a university in Shinjuku. And on the right-hand side is basically a tower which we have financed in Madrid for Instituto Empresa. It's a private university. The planning was already established, so the tower had to be built the way it was. It was meant for office with a podium for Congress, and the university basically put all the amenities in the podium, including the sports facility, and then the vertical campus, you know, for the students. So there are maybe different ways we have to think going forward. And then finally, and to conclude on that part is mayors don't like trees. Why? Because they don't grow as fast as their mandate, probably, you know, and they have to deal with the leaves. Here's a good example in Tokyo. The Marunouchi district was very mineral. And over the years, they really have rejuvenated that part of Tokyo by planting trees. And I go to China, you know, once a year. We have a fairly large portfolio in China. I mean, 2 billion out of 90, so all is safe. But I think what I always admire in China is they have this huge nursery somewhere in the country, and when the project is finished, the trees arrive already in a mature state, and you come and you think, well, that project has been there forever, because it does change the look and feel of a district. So urbanism, I think we should not completely forget about it. I think going forward, I think there will be an expectation by society that institutional investors, developers, and investors, you know, think about how we go about it. I'll complete my talk before I open up to Q&A on the anthropologist. Okay, so where does the anthropologist here come in? I don't pretend to be an anthropologist, okay, but I just came back in May, I went to Brazil, okay, and first time going to Brazil. I've never been to that country, famous for its nature, you know, and one of the things you see in Brazil is this unbelievable orchidea which grow out of a tree. So you have a tree and then you have another plant growing off that tree, okay, because nature is very prevalent. Next to it is an incredible project of a conversion of a clinic into a mixed-use project involving nature as well as many different uses. The concept of hybridization, what does that mean? It's a concept developed by a French philosopher. French people always have to quote philosophers for some reason, okay? Alpern, who basically says, listen, in the world of tomorrow, you need to get people and usages to be intricated so that they feed off each other, you know, and that's a sort of a new concept for us because we do mixed-use projects, all of us here, but they are sort of siloed next to each other, okay, and then maybe people will basically work together. And I think going forward, you will need to create assets, you know, where basically the usages can complement each other. And I'll give you one example. Kevin brings his students to MIPIM every year, so it's nice to meet them there. And I'm also the jury president for the MIPIM Awards, which gives award to notable real estate projects across the world. And last year we gave the top prize to this building. If you go to Paris, by the way, that restaurant on the top, Bonnie, is very good. You know, I highly recommend. It's one of the best views you can have in Paris because it's a high rise in Le Marais. At the beginning of Le Marais, which you don't usually have. It's a 1950s building which was belonging to the city. The city gave it up. They made a competition. A developer bought it. They added 2 floors built by Chipperfield. And you are just behind Notre Dame. So when you are in that building, you have a view on Paris, which you don't have anywhere else, okay? And the interesting thing about that building, it has been developed by a French developer owned by Nuveen. It has 9 different usages. And these usages can be counterintuitive. It has basically a luxury 5-star hotel and a 300-bed youth hostel. It has residential and affordable housing. It has a wet market and contemporary art galleries. It has office and co-working, and it has an urban farm on top. All these usages, feed each other because, where you come to a hotel, you want to be cool, and maybe the people going to the youth hostel are cooler than you are, and you mix up, in the bar upstairs, and going to a wet market buying your meat, is sort of fun, and nothing prevents you to go to the art gallery just after. So I think there's a different way to think about it. Another example that was the runner-up to the prize was Roots in the Sky. It's a developer called Fabrics. I think these are ex-Blackstone people, some of them, and they took an existing site in the south part of London, which was a courthouse. So the base was a courthouse, and they are building a structure on top, and then they are going to have the biggest forest, 120 trees, 10,000 type of plants on the top, but more interestingly, it will be open to the public. So that garden is not going to be just for the tenants, for the headquarters, or whatever it will be. It will also be something where there is a barn where basically community work can be done. And I think tenants these days expect that mix of usages, especially with populations, they are not necessarily interacting with on a daily basis. We have example in our own portfolio. I mean, the picture on the top left-hand side is a building which we renovated in Amsterdam. It had a big atrium, but more interestingly, that atrium is used twice a week by the Philharmonic of Amsterdam to rehearse, okay? We felt that will the tenants be okay with it, because rehearsal of an orchestra is not always beautiful. There's a lot of repetition and so on, but they love it. And the building in the middle is a building which we have in Berlin. It's going to be the new Amazon headquarters in Germany or in Europe. And one of the conditions, of course, of the municipality, but I think Amazon was open to it, was to open up the building to the public so that the public could access certain parts, basically, of the building. So, what could be the next frontier in basically hybridization is, I think, collectively, we have to think about a more intense use of our asset. Is it normal that a building is used only 30% of the time as an office, 70% it will be empty? Is it normal that a school courtyard is only used 7% of the time, empty 93% of the time? There are 150 empty parking spots in Paris, okay? So I think we have to think about what usage can we give to our space maybe outside the office hours. What usage can we give to our building beyond office? For example, using the roofs for facilities. You go to China and you see all the malls. Most of these malls, or many of the malls, have now sports facility and running track on top of these malls. It's obvious, it's a big piece of land, it just happens to be higher up than the ground and is being used, What can you do with underground space? Can you use it to grow vegetables? How can you basically fill up the space? And, one of the good things coming out of COVID is the fact that we are using now the public space. You see that in Paris and you see that in New York being used by basically restaurants, as an extension of their terrace. So I think here we are on that journey. So my message to you is, of course, finance matters. That's what I do on a day-to-day basis. But as we think about the built environment, we won't escape the fact that we will need to work on data and on retooling of our assets. We will be involved in playing a role in urbanism and thinking about our communities and how we have them work together, I think is going to be essential. So I wanted to bring some sort of bright spots, not that the panel before was pessimistic, but we go to a lot of conferences and I think we are at a unique time. PIMCO says, there are 5 Ds. The first 2 Ds is around dislocation and debt. So there is a dislocation which is coming. We had a very good panel on that. So you can see that immediate opportunities coming up on the high yield side. But at the same time, there are very strong secular trends around digital, demographics, decarbonization, which also makes it interesting to think a little bit long term, because real estate will remain an essential asset class for every investor. First of all, they got a taste of it, and assuming they can go through the valuation process, which is going to be going a bit downwards. I think if they can digest that, I think you will see investors be ready to reinvest maybe a couple of years from now. Kevin, you have students of architecture each year when I come to your class, so I also wanted to let them know that we do have some famous architects, in our own portfolio, okay? And the headquarters in Milan from Isozaki, I think it's structural, these little pieces on the side. I hope they withstand, the building. But all the rest are good architects, Inside, it's not always the best buildings, but for sure you notice them in the landscape. So that's what I wanted to cover in the time which was given to me, but I think we might have some time for Q&A. Any questions on one of the 4 trades, which I basically was trying to portray today. Thank you so much. Oh yeah, there's a question over there.
Thanks. I think it's interesting how you lay out, a broader role for finance than just finance. And so I guess I'm wondering how much in your day-to-day or how you approach really placemaking, which is sort of where you're getting at with the urbanism, in your day-to-day. How does that actually impact how you approach projects?
I spend much more time on this engineering piece, okay? Because I think on the decarbonization, at least in Europe, I know the US is a bit of a more difficult topic, but in Europe and to some extent in Asia, the why is understood, okay? So it's really all about the how, okay? And the how requires basically to get to the data, okay? People all speak about AI. AI can only start if you have data. It's not out of thin air, okay? So I think structuring your data around your assets, something which probably we haven't done much because, we may maybe not keeping the assets so long. So I think that takes an increasing part of my time, and I think for other investors as well, and ensuring that we have the right staffing of people who can basically do that. I think the urbanism part, it depends on the person's lens and what they find interesting, but I think to give a vision to people, especially in difficult cycle, about, I think, the potential of an industry, and making them aware as well that, you live in a community where, there's an expectation that you contribute to society one way or another, Having a building at some point of time will be seen as a luxury in a world where carbon will be limited, Having a building will bring a responsibility to make full use of it, because I think the time where you can just demolish everything, rebuild, I think is going to be probably more limited. So that part is still, of course, a small part. Of course, the finance part, especially in markets where rates are changing, keeps us extremely busy, working on the lending book and some of the foreclosure we have to do and some of the retooling. So yes, it keeps me, of course. I'm still a financier at the base, okay? So might not have the glass in my hands, but that's all, Yeah.
Thank you so much for a presentation that looks a lot less like finance, a little bit more like architecture these days. And I really appreciated your framing the role of the financier from that to anthropologist. I do have a question for you that's a little bit more current. How do you manage risk, particularly in Allianz's portfolios around climate change and reaching net zero carbonization?
Yeah, the climate change is, we use a company called Jupiter, and we are doing a very thorough due diligence on flooding risk. For example, we have a fairly large business in Japan doing residential. It's a very good business in Japan, by the way, residential. It's a declining demography country. There's, I think, minus 1 million a year. But Tokyo, as a capital city, still has a stable population and actually increasing households. Okay, and therefore, if you can cater to these smaller households, studios, 1 bedroom, there is a very strong market. And Japanese tenants always pay; they would rather leave than not pay. So unlike France, so it's a very good market to be in. But one thing we found out is that Japan has all these artificial sort of rivers. Riverbeds have been, built out, and you have these flash floods now in Japan, very strong. And we found out that some of our assets actually were quite exposed to flooding, okay, in this period of time. So we had to come up with measurements, put them in our underwriting, so that we were putting the necessary gates and so on to avoid that, okay. I think they're also part of the world where you have to ask yourself, do you really want to invest there? You know, we do have some investment in Florida, but not many. So I think people will think differently about the resiliency of their portfolio and how to make the portfolio more resilient. Decarbonization, I would say, it's easy. You know, you just have to set yourself a goal and not say, okay, trust me, I will be there in 2050. You need to measure it every year. And I think that part, I'm not actually that concerned in the sense that it's actually not as expensive as we think it is, you know. Of course, the building has to be worth doing it, okay? If you have a building where, you know, rents are going to come down and so on, you do have a problem. And it's true that as an institutional investor, I should say, we're probably, cheating is not the right word because we never cheat, but when an asset is really obsolete and basically cannot meet the target, we would sell it. So somebody else will own it. It's not going away from the planet, okay? And if you buy a new building, a brand new building, of course, your net zero carbon footprint is already there. But the embodied carbon, which was necessary to build the building, is with the developer, okay? So I think over time, we will have to take care of the two bookends as well if you want to do a thorough job. But if we already do a very good job on operational carbon on a portfolio of that size, I think we can do a meaningful contribution. All done? Good. Thank you.